up, my fellow lore lovers? And welcome back to Loreplay. Anyone else feeling like, what a fucking year this month has been? Or is that just me? You know what? I know that it's not just me because I doom scroll like the rest of you, and it's definitely a collective thing. I'm your host, Dayna Pereira, and I figure if we're gonna live in a collection of what the actual fuck moments, then, maybe we can commiserate with other collections of what the actual fuck moments. So today, for mental health purposes, we're going to take a trip out of the US. And if you're already out of the US, then lucky. We are heading in to one of the most aggressively haunted places on Earth. A place so cursed that even locals won't go near it. A place so steeped in death that the ground itself is comprised of horror. And yeah, just wait until we get to that part. A place the Italian government tried to auction off, and everyone collectively said, absolutely the fuck not. Today, we're talking about Poveglia Island and the Black Death. Because why do just one when you can have a twofer? So pour yourself a goblet of wine, we're in Italy, remember, and grab your emotional support cheese, because this story has plague pits, mass graves, mental asylums, bell towers, screaming ghosts, and one doctor who absolutely should not have had a medical license. Poveglia Island is a tiny island in the Venetian lagoon that has been called the most haunted place in the world. Now, I'm sure that that's subjective, but at least one person has said that. But before we can go there, we have to talk about the Black Death. The thing about death is that it usually arrives quietly. Not today, though. Today, it arrives on a ship. Not a dramatic ghost ship with fog and a cursed violinist, but something worse. A perfectly normal trading vessel drifting into port. Its sails limp, its crew either missing or very much not okay. No alarms, no sirens, just rats, fleas, and history about to absolutely lose its mind. The Black Death was the pandemic that wiped out somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. And that tiny Venetian island that we talked about, that became its emotional support mass grave. Picture Europe in the early 1300s. There's no antibiotics, no germ theory, no concept of maybe don't dump sewage in the street and then drink downstream. Just straight up raw dogging disease. People believed illness came from things like bad air, sin, astrology, or God being in a mood. If someone got sick or anything at all bad happened to someone, they thought that person must have done something to deserve it. No wrong place, wrong time, wrong bacteria here. Just God striking you down for being an undercover sinner. Medicine was a charming blend of prayer, bloodletting, and what if we just tried something horrifying and hoped for the best? This is important because when the Black Death showed up, Europe had no emotional or scientific framework for what was happening. There was no flatten the curve. There was no CDC or masking or staying 6 feet apart. There was just screaming, superstition, and an absolute commitment to doing the wrong thing with confidence. You ever watch someone do something so deeply incorrect, but with their full chest? That was medieval public health. Most historians agree the Black Death was caused by a bacterium often carried by fleas living on rats. And yes, pneumonic spread can happen too, because the plague loves options. This thing likely moved west along major trade routes connecting Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Because humans cannot resist spices, silk, and making every disease international. By 1347, it reached Europe, and it did not knock before entering. One of the most infamous early entries happened in Sicily. When ships arrived, sailors were either dead, dying, or covered in strange swellings, called buboes, in their armpits, groins, and necks. People didn't know what the fuck to think. Was it poison? Witchcraft? Divine punishment? But no one thought, maybe the fleas. Which, I mean, yeah, like, you can't know until you know, and they weren't exactly on the cutting edge of science back then. Bacteria wouldn't even be identified for centuries. The plague bacterium wasn't nailed down until 1894, which means medieval Europe was basically trying to solve a murder mystery without even knowing what murder was. Once infected, symptoms hit you fast. You would get a fever, chills, vomiting. You know, your typical body fighting off something bad symptoms. But then came the gross stuff. Bleeding under the skin, which turned people dark purple or black, hence the name. Then came the buboes, which were swollen lymph nodes the size of like an apple or an egg, just filled with pus and regret. Once infected, you could be knocking on death's door from anywhere to 2 to 7 days, sometimes faster. And the mortality rates were brutal. Bubonic plague was between 30 and 60% fatal. And if you happen to be one of the lucky people that got the pneumonic plague, c'est la vie, you were screwed. Damn near everyone died. Entire households died. Villages vanished. Clergy just dropped mid-sermon. Gravediggers ran out of graves. And then Europe collectively said, okay, but like, what if we scapegoated this whole shebang? With no understanding of bacteria, people turned to what they did understand. Fear. Remember that whole you must deserve this sinner thing we talked about? Flagellants, not flatulence, marched through towns whipping themselves bloody, convinced God wanted pain as an apology gift. I mean, it kind of sounds like whatever God that was is a sadist. Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells and massacred across Europe. You know that phrase, poisoning the well? Yup, rooted in the plague, because Jewish people were accused and sometimes coerced to confess to spreading the disease through public drinking wells. All of Venice freaked the fuck out, obviously, and decided they needed a place to store the sick to save the city from death. Enter Poveglia Island. But this island had a long history of crazy shit way before the plague happened. So I guess what I'm really trying to drive home here is that Poveglia did not start out chill. Its story begins in fear. The name Poveglia goes back to Roman times, possibly tied to Roman roads and infrastructure in the lagoon, which means that people have been side-eyeing this place for a long time. By the early Middle Ages, this wasn't some abandoned rock. It was an actual settlement. People lived there. There were houses. There was farming. There was local administration. It was giving small town energy, except with way more anxiety. According to early historical accounts, people began settling Poveglia around 421 CE. Not because it was a cute little coastal town, but because they were fleeing collapsing Roman cities and various invasions. The lagoon offered protection, which is great in theory unless someone decides to cut off your supplies. And some accounts describe exactly that. Enemies attempting to fence off the island, blocking resources, leading to starvation and prolonged suffering. So, like, right out of the gate, Poveglia's origin story is terror, isolation, and people desperately hoping no one notices them. Fun start. Then we get to the second origin story. And this one is legend, but very on brand. Medieval sources link Poveglia to the assassination of Doge Pietro Tradonico in 864 CE, which was your classic medieval power struggle. Political tension, conspirators, stabbing, absolutely no chill. In this version of events, people connected to the assassination were eventually exiled and sent to Poveglia, permanently banned from Venice. The details vary wildly: dramatic standoffs, fortified buildings, tense negotiations. But the takeaway is consistent. If you were politically inconvenient or freshly involved in a murder plot, Venice was like, congrats, you live on the island now, forever. So, yes, exile and violence are now officially a part of the island's brand. And just in case the vibes were not already off enough, there's also the fire. According to later legend, in 1334, a massive fire tore through Poveglia, destroying dozens of homes and displacing entire families. Were the numbers exact? Probably not. Was it still devastating? Absolutely. Medieval islands were basically tinderboxes surrounded by water and bad luck. Fire, famine, exile, invasions. None of this is supernatural, but it does mean that from day one, Poveglia wasn't shaped by peace, prosperity, or joy. It was shaped by people fleeing danger, being forcibly sent away, losing everything and trying to survive anyway. So, before we ever get to plague pits, quarantine, or modern ghost stories, Poveglia was already dick deep and crazy. Now we're back in the mid 1300s. Plague hit Europe like a biblical freight train. Entire towns collapsed in weeks. People were dying so fast that society didn't have time to panic properly. It just went straight to chaos. Bodies piled up. Clergy died before they could perform last rites. Families sealed their doors and hoped for the best. Venice, however, had a very specific problem. As a major maritime power, it couldn't just shut down trade and wait it out. Ships were arriving constantly from all over the known world. And now, those ships were floating disease dispensers. So, Venetian officials did something that, at the time, was genuinely innovative and also deeply ruthless. They invented quarantine. Ships suspected of carrying plague were held offshore for 40 days. If no one got sick, great, welcome to Venice. If someone did, congratulations, you are no longer Venice's problem. You were removed. And this is where Poveglia Island comes back into the story. Poveglia wasn't chosen because it was spooky. It wasn't chosen because people thought it was cursed. It was chosen because it was useful. It was close enough to Venice to monitor, far enough away to isolate, and already emotionally associated with exile and abandonment, which honestly made it the perfect candidate. If you were suspected of infection, not confirmed, suspected, you were put on a boat and sent there. No appeals, no second opinions, no, but I just have allergies. Families were separated at the docks. People begged. Some were visibly ill. Some weren't sick at all yet. And because no one understood bacteria, transmission, or literally anything useful, everyone was guessing. And when humans guess under pressure, they do not guess kindly. Remember in COVID, if someone even dared look like they were going to sniffle, they were sent home? Kind of like that. Except this wasn't home, it was an island full of people dying. And if you were sent there, it was likely that you were going to die too. Did not matter. Once you arrived on Poveglia, there was no treatment plan. There was no cure. There was only observation and containment. If you lived, you waited. If you died, you were buried or burned. Fires burned constantly, not ceremonial or respectful, but practical. This wasn't about honoring the dead. It was about reducing risk. Over time, the island became less a quarantine station and more a processing center for human loss. Mass graves were dug quickly. Ash mixed into the soil. And while later stories exaggerate the numbers, the truth is still grim. Thousands of people passed through Poveglia during plague outbreaks, and many never left. What makes this part especially dark isn't just the death, it's the psychology. On Poveglia, people stopped being patients. They became variables. You weren't someone to be saved, you were someone to be contained. And even those who survived carried the mark of almost dead. Returning to Venice didn't mean returning to normal. It meant being quietly avoided forever. And this use of Poveglia didn't happen once. The island was repeatedly reused during later outbreaks. So when people talk about Poveglia as a place soaked in death, they're not being dramatic. They're being literal. And just when you think, surely humanity learned something from the 1300s, nope. Because while the first wave of the Black Death was the most catastrophic, it was absolutely not the last. Plague kept circling back for centuries like a cursed house guest that never got the hint. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe was still dealing with outbreaks, smaller than before, but terrifying enough to send cities straight back into panic mode, Venice included. By this point, Venice had experience. They had systems, they had protocols, and unfortunately, those protocols were built on the same core principle as before. Contain first, ask questions never. So, when the plague reappeared, Poveglia was back in business. Because once an island has been designated where we put the sick, that's its personality forever. By the 17th and 18th centuries, doctors were no longer guessing quietly. They were guessing with authority. And this is the era of the plague doctor. You know, the one with the beaked mask that looks like a cosplay nightmare. And just to be clear, that mask was not protecting anyone in any meaningful way. The beak was stuffed with herbs and spices, flowers, and sometimes vinegar-soaked rags. Because doctors believed disease traveled via miasma, which is bad air. So if you smelled rosemary instead of death, you were fine. You know, science. Now, some of the most completely unhinged things about the plague were the treatments. Because they were literally just making shit up, just pulling it straight out of their asses. Being a doctor back then kind of feels like you just walked up to somebody and introduced yourself as a doctor. And everyone was like, yeah, okay, what's up, doc? Now, before we drag them, lovingly, of course, remember, there was no germ theory, no microscopes, no understanding of bacteria, and everything bad was believed to be imbalance, poison air, got on their period, or you did something to deserve this. Doctors worked under the theory that your body was ruled by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And the plague meant that those fluids were having beef with one another. So the obvious solution: remove fluids, add weird things, pray aggressively. One of the top treatments was bloodletting, and this was like the go to treatment. Doctors would cut or open a vein to drain blood. Sometimes they would use leeches, sometimes a tool called a flame, because clearly the perfect time to drain someone of their blood is when they're already sick and weak. The logic was that the plague was caused by bad blood, so remove the blood. Bada bing, bada boom, you're probably dead. Patients were already dehydrated, septic, and dying. Bloodletting often killed them faster, but doctors doubled down because if the patient died, it was obviously because they didn't bleed enough. Duh. And this next one, I'm gonna try and get through with a straight face because it is documented and it is real, but it sounds like it came straight from an article out of The Onion. Okay, let's set the scene. Oh no, you have buboes. Those huge swollen lymph nodes associated with the plague, remember? Okay. And then the doc, dressed like Gothic Big Bird, is like, ooh, I have just the thing for that. He then takes a live chicken, plucks its feathers so its bare ass is exposed, and straps the chicken's butthole directly onto your buboes. Then the chicken would just be chilling there with its asshole touching your bare skin until it died, passed out, or you made a miraculous recovery. It wasn't always chickens, though. Sometimes they would use a pigeon. Or, and I fucking hate saying this out loud, a puppy. Now, why the fuck would they strap a chicken ass to you? Because they believed the animal would draw the poison out of the body, like a medieval Brita filter. When the chicken died, doctors went, see? It absorbed the plague. No, sir. What actually happened is that you pressed a raw chicken ass into an infected wound. Humans are silly. Now, next up in the magical world of made-up treatments was snakes. Because why wouldn't it be? They symbolize rebirth. They're venomous, so that definitely equates to medicinal. And the biblical ties are just too on brand. Treatment would include eating snake flesh or applying it to the wounds. Then they had viper broth, dried snake powders, or snake mixed with herbs and wine. And all of a sudden, I feel like we've materialized into an Indiana Jones movie. The idea was that poison fights poison, which is kind of like someone drinking antifreeze and then the doctor giving them cyanide to help. But yeah, sure, I guess it makes total sense. If you were rich, you were lucky enough to afford this oceanfront property in Arizona, which, stick with me, is the same vibe as what they were selling as a cure to the wealthy back then. Are you ready for this? Unicorn horn. I'm not kidding. Unicorn horn was believed to neutralize poison, purify water, cure the plague, prevent death, and fix all the vibes. But, spoiler alert, nobody could actually get their hands on a unicorn horn. Unicorns are far too fast and far too smart for them. So they were actually selling them narwhal tusks, or sometimes a rhino's horn, and sometimes just wood. But it was expensive, so only royalty could afford it, which meant, well, the poor died, but the rich survived, so clearly it works. Again, science. Definitely had nothing to do with class or sanitation or anything else that the privileged had that the poor didn't. Nope, definitely not. It was 100% the unicorn. No further questions. Gemstones were also used constantly in medieval medicine. Emeralds were believed to protect against the plague, purify the body, and absorb disease. They would grind them into a powder, wear them as amulets, place them on the buboes, or mix in with drinks. Because when you're on death's door and someone tells you to gargle sparkly rocks, what else are you going to do? And one of the most famous plague medicines was the everything soup. It was a soup made with 40 to 80 ingredients: herbs, spices, opium, snake flesh, wine, honey, resin, tears of the boar. It took months to prepare and was absurdly expensive. Doctors swore by it. Patients mostly died. And since plague was thought to come from miasma or bad air, other treatments included burning herbs, carrying flowers, holding perfume balls, lighting fires indoor, and the ever so refreshing sitting in smoke. Plague doctors wore masks stuffed with lavender, cloves, roses, and myrrh, which did absolutely nothing except make death smell nicer. And as a shock to no one, plague doctors had a crazy high mortality rate, with some estimations as high as 90%. I mean, when your cure is chicken asses, I'm not sure what else you expected. And because I love you, here are a few bonus chaos treatments that we didn't deep dive, like sitting in human urine, rubbing wounds with feces, drinking vinegar and arsenic, cutting open buboes with no anesthesia, and, of course, praying harder. As it turns out, thoughts and prayers didn't do much back then either. If none of that worked, it was assumed the patient either didn't try hard enough or God simply wanted them dead. Cool system. By this time, Venice understood one thing correctly: bodies were dangerous. They didn't know about bacteria, but they knew the proximity to the dead correlated strongly with more dead people. So when plague deaths spiked, disposal became urgent. Not ceremonial or respectful, urgent. And once again, Poveglia became a place for that urgency. Poveglia became a drop-off point, a holding zone, and eventually a terminal destination. People sent there were not always dead. They were sick, exposed, suspected, or simply unlucky. All it took was a pissed off neighbor to say you sneezed and off you went. Once you were sent to Poveglia, you were effectively erased from society. Bodies arrived by boat daily, sometimes stacked, sometimes tangled together, sometimes still warm. The island could not keep up with the burial, so they burned. Bodies were piled into trenches or pits and set on fire. Ash and bone left where they fell. And, if I may, I'm about to make you deeply, deeply unsettled. Because, historically, plague victims often slipped into comas, delirium, and paralysis. Death confirmation was rudimentary at best. Fear outweighed caution by, a lot. Venetian records and contemporary plague chronicles confirm people were declared dead prematurely, and those who appeared unresponsive were sent with the dead. Now, if you're doing the math, you've probably figured out that that equals people being burned alive. There's no surviving document that says on Poveglia X number of people were burned alive, but there are records of people awakening in plague pits elsewhere in Italy, screams heard from burial sites, and movement seen among corpses. And Poveglia followed the same procedures, just faster, more frequently, and with less oversight. So, yeah, it almost certainly happened. And probably way more than once. Now, here's the part that moves Poveglia from creepy to biologically horrifying. The island was reused for centuries, layer after layer of bodies, ash, and decomposition. Archaeologists can identify plague zones without artifacts just by soil chemistry. On Poveglia, the soil is the artifact. Estimates vary, but a commonly cited figure suggests that up to half of the island's soil contains human remains or ash, which makes the reality this. If you walk on Poveglia, you are not walking on graves, you are walking in them. Imagine getting home after a visit and realizing you have a little speck of Giuseppe on your shoe. And as if that wasn't enough for one place, now we stack the final layer of horror on top of the plague ash. Because apparently someone looked at Poveglia and said, you know what this island built on mass graves needs? Mental health care. Welcome to the asylum era. By the late 19th and 20th century, plague had faded, but Poveglia was still isolated, stigmatized, and unwanted, which made it perfect for something else society didn't want to see. Italy, like much of Europe, was modernizing psychiatry. And by modernizing, I mean the same old song and dance we talked about in last week's episode. Overcrowded institutions, minimal oversight, maximum isolation, questionable ethics, and zero fucking chill. Poveglia already had buildings, guarded access, and a reputation that kept people away. So around the early 1900s, parts of the island were converted into the mental hospital, a place for people deemed unfit for society, which we already know can mean anything from depressed, disabled, traumatized, old, or actual mental illness. Once you arrived, leaving was unlikely. Just like the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, this one had severe overcrowding, poor sanitation, and minimal medical care. Remember, this was an island already soaked in death. Now, besides the normal restraints and torture tactics passed off as healthcare, it's said that they also did experimental surgeries, which I doubt anyone actually volunteered for. According to Venetian lore, a senior doctor oversaw the asylum. He believed that insanity could be corrected surgically. Procedures were often experimental, brutal, and fatal. Patients could be heard screaming during operations, and the deaths were frequent and unexplained. At first, he was the authority, but then he began to change. The legend says the doctor began experiencing auditory hallucinations. He would hear voices whispering at night, bells ringing when no one was pulling them, and see figures in the fog near the tower. He reportedly told staff, "The island speaks." And this is where plague history bleeds into asylum trauma. Because imagine this man, living on an island built on ash and bone, working above mass graves, hearing the lagoon wind through ruins, surrounded by suffering, isolation, and silence. Whether madness, guilt, or something else, the doctor reportedly became terrified of the tower, and yet strangely drawn to it. They said that the doctor climbed the bell tower and either jumped or was pushed. Some versions say that he survived the fall and laid screaming on the ground. And then the tower bell rang and he died. Other versions say the hospital staff was just over his bullshit and finished him off. So who knows? Maybe they rang the bell in celebration after his demise. The bell is no longer there. but people still report hearing it. After the asylum shut its doors, Poveglia didn't become peaceful. It became useful and repurposed. Again. During the World Wars, the island was intermittently used by the Italian military as a storage site, a lookout, and a buffer island guarding Venice. Soldiers stationed nearby refused night duty. They heard bells ringing, even though the bell in the bell tower was long gone at that point. They would see lights in buildings with no power and a dense fog that rolled in suddenly and swallowed sound. No official haunting reports, of course. Just a shit ton of reassignment requests, probably. By the late 20th century, Poveglia's reputation hardened into something specific. Not just haunted, unapproachable. A commonly reported phenomena included screaming or coughing heard from the island, apparitions near the shoreline, shadow figures in windows, just to name a few. And this is the part that gets me. The Venetians won't fucking go there. They won't picnic there. They won't fish near it. They won't joke about it. They won't dock boats there casually. They call it the Island of Ghosts, or Plague Island. When locals avoid a place this hard, it's hard not to take that seriously. Poveglia is officially closed to the public, but that doesn't stop humans from humaning. We hear off limits and immediately think, yeah, but not for me. Tourists began offering boat operators cash for just a quick stop. Most refused, but those who didn't often reported their engines stalling near the island or sudden weather changes, passengers panicking without a clear cause, and an overwhelming urge to leave. Some guides flat out say, "You couldn't pay me enough." Others say, "I took somebody once and never again." Now, what has me cackling is that Italy tried to motherfucking sell the island in 2010. For real, it went up for auction. They didn't want it so bad that they put it up for sale. Now, things get a little murky with the fact and the lore here, but the story goes that an Italian businessman with plans to turn the island into a luxury resort bid 400,000 euros for the island, or somewhere around there. After entering the deal, his daughter started having intense nightmares. She spoke about a man or figures that she was seeing. She became afraid to sleep and her behavior changed dramatically. Some versions say it was during a visit to the island, but the timing is always emphasized. It started only after her father became involved with Poveglia. Apparently, that was enough for him to dip out of the deal. I mean, centuries upon centuries of death and horror were fine, but baby girl has a scary dream and we've gone too far. Poveglia sat empty, minus a few brave tourists over the years. But in 2025, a civic group secured a 99-year lease to turn the island into an urban park, open only to the residents of the city. I mean, I guess that's one way to tell tourists to kick rocks. So now we'll just have to wait and see what happens there, because the history is dark. Assassinations, people fleeing, fires, plague, burn pits, more plague, soil made up of human ash, ghosts, bells, asylums, experimental surgeries, a mad doctor, suicide. I mean, truly, what could go wrong? Some places don't want to be redeemed. Some places don't want a second act. Some places don't want a rebrand. They're waiting to be left alone. So if you ever find yourself staring across the Venetian lagoon, looking at a patch of land no one wants to talk about, maybe just send a good vibe or two its way. I mean, It is the most haunted place on earth, for Christ's sake. It certainly needs it. And that'll do it for this week's episode. I mean, holy shit. I don't know what you guys thought of that one, but the whole thing just absolutely blows my mind. I'm probably not going to be the tourist that bribes my way onto the island, but I mean, quite frankly, that could change after a few glasses of wine. If you liked this one, if you could head to Apple or Spotify and hit me with a rate and review, I would appreciate it. And until next time, don't let anyone strap a chicken's ass to your body, even if you have the plague. Maybe just try chicken soup instead.